second LAMACLIMA webinar on the effects of irrigation on climate change. The webinar is part of a series of 3 webinars, of which one already took place, and it will take about 1 hour. And we have 2 speakers today, Wim Thiery and Kashif Salik, who will each speak for 15 minutes. Wim is part of the LAMACLIMA project consortium, and Kashif works for the Sustainable Development Policy Institute in Pakistan and joins us as a regional expert. My name is Inga Menke and I work for Climate Analytics, and I will be moderating today. Before we start, I would like to draw your attention to the modalities of the webinar, which are the same as last time in case you joined our last webinar. So we are recording the webinar and we will share it later on our website. So those that missed the webinar can actually look at it later. You can also have a look at the recording from the first webinar. The link was sent to you via email. We would kindly ask you to rename yourself and put your name and your organization or your institute. And if you join privately, you can either just write your name or you write private behind your name. You can do so by looking at the participants list and finding your own name. And then you right-click on More, and there you should have a button that says Rename. We also turn off the video of everyone except the speakers, so that we don't use too much traffic. If you encounter any technical issues, I would kindly ask you to contact Burcu Yesil from Climate Analytics through the Zoom chat, so you can write her a private message there. Due to the time constraints and large numbers of participants, we will not allow for an oral discussion, but we will use Slido to ask questions. How does that work? So you go to sli.do and you key in the Slido code 010919. And then you can type any question you might have also throughout the webinar. So when you hear one of the speakers and you have a question, you can just post it there and then it's not forgotten. Everyone is able to see all the questions or also comments. And when reading the questions, you can like those that you're interested in as well. And this allows also to not double the same question, but we kind of stick to having each question only once there. If people like questions, they move up in the queue. So they are not according to the time when they were asked, but rather according to priority by participants. And when we come to the Q&A part, we will go according to the priority. So those questions that are most liked will be tackled first. You can also, if you have a specific question to one of the speakers, you can also straight away mark it by saying @Wim or @Kashif. And if we don't get through the full list of questions and comments, we will somehow address them after the webinar, but we will try to stick to 1 hour because otherwise I think we are dragging too long. I will share the code again in the Zoom chat in a minute. But let me move on. It's also still on the slide, but you won't see it anymore once our speakers start. In terms of how we go about it, we will take now 15 minutes for Wim's presentation. Then we will have 15 minutes for Kashif's presentation. And afterwards, we will have about 30 minutes for the Q&A. So in between, you will not be able to ask directly to Wim questions after his presentation, but we take all the questions at the end. So we will start with the first presentation by Wim Thiery, who works as a professor at the Vrije Universiteit Brussel, or VUB, and he's involved in modeling the interactions between water resources and the atmosphere under a changing climate. Wim holds a PhD from the KU Leuven, where he investigated the interactions between climate and the African Great Lakes with a regional climate model. And afterwards, he worked as a postdoc at ETH in Zurich, where he investigated historical and future impacts of irrigation on climate extremes. And today he will share insights of his recent study on irrigation impacts on hot extremes. Wim, I would hand over to you, so I will stop sharing and you can share your screen. And you have 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Inga. Can you see my screen, Inga, and everyone?
Yes.
Great, thank you very much. So, yes, also welcome from my side. Great to see so many people present today. So my name is Wim Thiery, and I will be presenting you today about the relationship between irrigation and climate. And the title of this presentation is Irrigation versus Global Warming, as if it were a boxing game. So please bear with me and let's get ready to rumble. So in climate science, we investigate the effects, we investigate how all the different components of the climate system interact with each other and how these interactions are influenced by human activities. Now, a key research tool to perform this research are global Earth system or Earth system models. So here you see a video showing you clouds, precipitation, and snow cover from a high-resolution simulation with the Community Earth System, or CESM, which is a climate model that we use for research in my team. Thanks to CESM and other models of this kind, we are today able to calculate how our CO2 emissions may change the climate and how the climate will evolve towards the future. And if emissions continue to rise, as due to today, global mean temperature may increase by 3 to almost 6 degrees by the end of this century. This type of numbers are given to us by these Earth system models. So what do we do when we're a climate modeler and we want to investigate the effect of something on climate? Well, we do a simulation with and without that effect. And this is what I'm showing you here in this example. Here we are looking at the results of a simulations with CSM with and without irrigation. Yeah? So here we are looking at the map of annual mean temperature, near surface air temperature, and how this is influenced by present-day irrigation. Now, irrigation, as we look at this map, is having a cooling effect on the climate in general. However, at the same time, I hope you will agree with me that the effect is very small and only localized in specific areas. So overall, on the overall climate, we can already from this map conclude that the overall effect of irrigation is relatively small. However, if we do not look at the annual mean temperature, but at the hottest day of the year, we can see that irrigation has a very pronounced effect. Actually, across irrigated lands, the present-day irrigation cools the hottest day of the year by about 0.8 degrees on average. And locally, this cooling can exceed 3 degrees. We also looked a bit deeper into the processes that cause this cooling, and we did that by performing a surface energy balance decomposition. So what we do technically is we take the total derivative of the surface energy balance and we solve for the change in surface temperature. What you see in this figure is the contribution of changes in individual surface energy balance components to the total surface temperature sigma. And here we are stacking the different contributions per month. So if we look at these different contributions, we can see, for instance, that predominant effect is an increase in evaporative fraction, whereby available net radiation at the surface is partitioned more into latent heat flux than into sensible heat flux. As a consequence, here we see the dark blue bars that are the latent heat flux contribution, showing a negative contribution to surface temperature, and sensible heat flux showing a smaller positive contribution to surface temperatures due to less energy escaping from the surface through turbulent mixing. Other effects are present, but they are much smaller. For instance, we have a slight positive albedo effect because irrigated soils are darker and hence absorb more solar radiation. And the clouds effects, they have mixed results, but in general, the effect is small. Now, if we then look at the total change, we actually see that the total change in surface temperature has a pronounced seasonal cycle, with most of the reduction in surface temperature occurring during warm, dry summer months. Now, this image that you're looking at here is for the Mediterranean, but we can also do the same analysis for other regions of the world. And here is now an example for South Asia, where we are actually seeing that this cooling occurs in a different season, in the spring, in the Northern Hemisphere spring, And also this is consistent with the fact that actually this is the dry pre-monsoon season. So overall, this was a quite useful exercise, and by doing this research, we learned quite a bit about the processes through which irrigation influences climate and temperature extremes. But the obvious next question to ask ourselves is, how does this irrigation-induced cooling compare against the historic warming that we have been observing, and which is caused by other anthropogenic activities, most notably the burning of fossil fuels and other greenhouse gas emissions? So to answer this question, we have been analyzing both model simulations and observational products. So when we start with the observational products, our first idea was to look into data sets that represent climate extremes, such as typically HABX2 or GHC and DX. However, these data sets typically have very coarse resolution and have almost no data over global irrigation hotspots. So instead, we decided to stick to a default product, the most used product in our field, which is CRU, and try to go as extreme as we can in this data set. So what do we do in practice? From this monthly data set, we take the daytime temperature of the warmest month of the year. And what we did is we took this variable and we plot that against the present day irrigated fraction. So this is an image which was made by Auke Visser, a PhD researcher at Wageningen University, and he was an intern. He did his internship with me at ETH a couple of years ago. So you're looking here at the observed change in temperature during the hottest month of the year as a function of present day irrigated fraction. And what these results are showing is that there is a clear negative relation, a negative correlation between these two quantities. This suggests already that irrigation has played an important role in affecting historical temperature evolution on land. Yeah. Yes. Now, there is one important limitation here with this data set, and that this data set is not really representative of extreme temperatures because we are still looking at the monthly time scale. And moreover, also this CRU data set has not so much observations in irrigation hotspots. So we do have to look at model simulations again to better understand what is happening here. And so we performed a set of simulations with CESM to quantify the effect of irrigation expansion throughout the 20th century on climate. And we did this by performing climate simulations at the beginning of the 20th century, and simulations for the present day climate. And here you see two maps that are giving the irrigation extent in these two simulations. So these pixels are showing you where we are activating the irrigation module and where we are allowing irrigation to happen. And when you look at these maps, one for 1915 and one for the year 2000, you can clearly see that there has been a strong expansion of irrigation in between those two periods. This is actually also shown in this plot, taken from a study by Siebert et al. So this is the study that developed this data set. And if you look at the two periods that we consider in our simulations, so the start of the 20th century and the present day climate, you can actually see that our simulations nicely capture this massive expansion of irrigation throughout the 20th century. Irrigation expanded by a factor 5 throughout the 20th century, and our simulations are capturing this increase. So what we can now do is plot the exact same plot as I showed you 2 slides earlier, but now with the model results on top of the observations. So the model results are now showing in orange, and the observations are still in blue. So if we look again at global land, we can see that the model is actually nicely able to reproduce the observed negative correlation between warming of high temperatures and change in irrigated fraction in this case. So this was on the left, the global land, and we can also look at it on the right for South Asia. And here you can see that actually this is our global irrigation hotspot. And you can see that also there, this negative correlation is clearly present. So overall, we were quite happy to see this, to see that CSM does quite a good job in reproducing this observed negative correlation. However, this is just a correlation, and we should not confuse correlation with causality. And I'm happy to show this video showing you that indeed we should not confuse correlation with causality. Yeah, it's not because you have a correlation in time between two movements that there is a causal link. So the next question that we have to ask ourselves, what is the contribution of irrigation to this negative correlation? Can we be sure that this negative correlation is caused by irrigation expansion? Now, to answer this question, we have applied a statistical technique that was initially developed by Sanjay Kumar and later on improved by Quentin Lejeune during his PhD research at ETH Zurich. So this method allows you to isolate the irrigation signal from the total temperature change. Now I can explain the technical details if people are interested in this during the Q&A, but here I will now immediately jump to the results of this method. And the results are shown at the bottom panels of this figure. So in the top panels, we have the plots that we saw already, the negative correlation. And then in the bottom panels, we have the contribution of irrigation expansion to this total signal. And when you look at these results, you can see that indeed irrigation has a strong contribution to this negative correlation, especially present in the model results, a bit less in the observations. But what you are seeing is that the stronger the expansion of irrigation throughout the 20th century, the stronger irrigation-induced cooling over the 20th century. So we now know that irrigation has had an influence on observed changes, and we know that the model does a pretty good job in representing these effects. But as I already mentioned, global gridded observations are limited in their ability to represent really extreme temperatures because they are available on monthly resolution. So now we go from the monthly resolution to the daily resolution, and we analyze daily temperature extremes using the probability ratio metric. Now, the probability ratio metric is giving you the probability of an event in a new situation relative to the event of a probability of an event in a reference situation. Let me give you a simple example of how this can be interpreted. Suppose you commute from your hometown to your office every day by train. And suppose that normally you have 1 out of 10 days your train is delayed, which means that you have a 10% probability that your train is delayed. But now there are railway works and your train is delayed every other day, which means that you have now a 50% probability of your train being delayed. If we plug in these numbers into this equation, we get the number of 5, which means that it is now 5 times more likely that your train is delayed in this new situation compared to the reference situation. Now, this is just a simple example, but we can apply this metric to answer the question how climate change altered the probability of hot extremes over the historical period. And if we do that, we get a map like this one. Now, the quantity that we are showing here is the 99th percentile of daily maximum temperature, which means in practice, on average, the 3 to 4 warmest days of the year. And the question is, what this map is showing is, how did the probability of such days change throughout the 20th century as a consequence of anthropogenic forcings, all forcings. And when you look at this map, you can see that hot extremes are becoming more likely basically everywhere across the globe. So there's nothing new about that. We know this already for a long time. But what is new in this study is that we can now compare this change in probability of hot extremes from all forcings to the effect of irrigation. And this is the map that we are getting. You are seeing in this map that irrigation expansion is generally leading to a reduction of the probability of hot extremes. Now, in contrast to the global warming signal, we see that the irrigation signal is very much confined into specific regions, into irrigation hotspots. Look at how you can identify, for instance, the Nile Valley on this map. And also the Indo-Gangetic Plains is clearly emerging as the global irrigation hotspot. Now we can...
Wim, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Sorry. So we can also take these two effects together now and look at the effect of all forcings. You can see when you take all forcings, all effects together, that the global warming signal is still dominating the overall picture, but that locally in those irrigation hotspots, irrigation has reduced the probability, has cancelled the effect of global warming, and in some cases even reversed the signal. Now we can also look at this at the regional scale, and I'm going to do this by selecting 4 countries: Pakistan, India, Nepal, and Bangladesh, as you can see now on this upper left map. And I'm taking the spatial median of the probability ratio in this region. And for my 99th percentile of daily maximum temperature, I get a median probability ratio of 2, which means in practice that an extreme, a high temperature which occurs once every 100 days in the early 20th century is in the present day climate occurring once every 50 days. Now we can do this for a range of temperature percentiles, and then we get this result showing that the more extreme your temperature percentile is, the more extreme your percentile, the higher the increase in probability over the 20th century. We can do the exact same thing for irrigation expansion, and you can see the exact opposite effect here, again showing that the more extreme the temperature percentile, the stronger the decrease in probability. If you take these two effects together, you can see that they effectively cancel each other out, and that if you take both effects together, there was essentially no change in the probability of hot extremes over South Asia. Now we did this over South Asia, but you can also do this over irrigated lands all over the world, and you can see that this effect is also present across irrigated pixels all over the world. However, if you look at all land, you can see that there is hardly any effect with it, simply because irrigated lands are taking up only a small fraction of the Earth's surface, of the land surface, and this is only, and the effects are really localized. So perhaps we shouldn't worry too much about this, we shouldn't make a big deal out of this. But I'm now coming to the end of my presentation, and here I'm plotting 2 maps of which I've removed the variable name that we are showing here. So maybe you can think about for yourself, what variables do you think are being plotted here? Yeah? I can say that the one on the left is the one which I've already shown earlier on in this presentation. So this is actually the present day irrigation extent, area equipped for irrigation in practice, showing you where we are irrigating. And the figure on the right is present day population density. Now, when you look at these maps, you can clearly see that there is a very strong correlation between irrigation extent and present day population density. So we basically irrigate where we live. This also means that the cooling from irrigation is experienced by the people living in those areas. Now, if you overlay population density map on the cooling effect, we arrive at a number of about 1 billion people less exposed to hot extremes in the historical period. So about 1 billion people did not experience the warming that you would expect from other anthropogenic activities. Now I should stress here that this is only talking about temperatures. We are not talking about heat stress here. Heat stress is a combination of temperature and relative humidity, and we have hypotheses, we have results showing that the increase in moisture into the boundary layer, into the surface layer from irrigation is actually canceling out the benefit of reduced temperatures. So coming to my last slide now, we have a number of open research questions. One which I already explained is the effect of temperature versus heat stress. Another one is the way in which we represent irrigation techniques in our climate models. There is room to improve that. But this is a key effect which I would like to highlight here. A key question in the field is what will happen into the future? Because the results I've been showing you are only happening because irrigation has massively expanded throughout the 20th century. Now we have strong indications that this expansion will not continue into the future, and also we are not able, whether or not we will have enough water available for irrigation. So there is actually a possibility that the irrigation-induced cooling that we have experienced in the past will level off in the next few decades, which might result in accelerated warming in irrigation hotspots. And finally, what is important is to assess this whole interplay between water security, food security, and climate interactions into one consistent framework. And this is also what will be addressed by the next speaker in this presentation. So I thank you for your attention, and I'm ending my presentation here. Thank you.
Thank you, Wim. Very interesting insights. And your presentation already triggered some questions for everyone. You can have a look at Slido, and also like those that you would like to see answered after the next presentation. I will now pass to Kashif Salik. Kashif has more than 18 years of experience in fieldwork, data management, and research, both in governmental and non-governmental organizations. He currently works at the Sustainable Development Policy Institute, or SDPI, and he is an associate research fellow. He worked in several international and regional research projects on, among others, food security, water resource development, and climate change. And before joining the SDPI, Kashif was a senior scientific officer for the Global Change Impact Study Center in Islamabad, Pakistan. Today, Kashif will share some of his rich insights from Pakistan in the context of effects of irrigation on climate change. And I would like to hand over to Kashif, who's already sharing his screen. You have also 15 minutes. And
thank you very much. Do you have...
Kashif, we see your comments, so...
do you see my presentation?
No, that's correct. Perfect.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, and also thank you for inviting me to present irrigation and climate change aspects of Pakistan. So I briefly touched the introduction side, what is the key irrigation and agriculture infrastructure in Pakistan. And also I will talk about the impact on people, the poverty and social vulnerabilities, because this is my area of research and I would like to focus on that, and how it is related to the irrigation. Thirdly, I will look into that how this agriculture production and food security related trends are there in Pakistan. And finally, the major part of my presentation is on irrigation and climate change. Do we have any adaptation potential for that? And finally, the policy challenges. This slide shows the introduction side of Pakistan. In the right side, you see the map of Pakistan showing the topography of different areas in Pakistan. And you see the dark area where most of the plain area of Pakistan is located. And we are going to talk about this because most of the agriculture and most of the irrigation is going to happen in this area, which is mostly present in Punjab and Sindh province of Pakistan. The red line shows the upper Indus Basin, or the area from where the rivers of most of the 5 rivers of Pakistan are originated, and they provide the water for agriculture. So agriculture sector actually it is one of the most vulnerable sector, and it's the source of vulnerability for climate change in Pakistan, because because Pakistan is mostly arid to semi-arid lands, and without surface irrigation, you can't able to produce you can't produce any agriculture production. So this area which I am talking about is about 20 million hectares. It's not a small area, and majority of population, 60% of population in there, and agriculture is about employ almost 40% of the workforce of Pakistan. So it's very important. Irrigation is very important for Pakistan. So major crops of Pakistan is wheat, rice, and sugarcane, which is also a very water-loving crops, and they have high water demands. Another important aspect which I like to highlight is that this production, agriculture production, is primarily occurring in small farmers, which is 95% of the small farms. And this is one of the source of vulnerability, that if there is any shock in irrigation or shock in climate change related impact, these are the most vulnerable area where farmers which are unable to cope up with these type of stresses. So these are one of the major characteristics of the Pakistan agriculture. This slide shows the irrigation system of Pakistan. On the left-hand side, it's a schematic diagram showing that the 5 major rivers and how they are connected. The first one is Indus, and then Jhelum, Chenab, Ravi, and Satluj. And during 1880s, during the British rule, this area is totally a cultural waste area, and few thousand people are actually living there. And then this colonial ruler, British Raj, has decided to build an irrigation infrastructure. And so they develop irrigation infrastructure. And you can see that there's number of canal commands are constructed within these rivers, and a huge web of canals and agricultural land was produced. And then thousands of millions of people then migrated from other parts of India, particularly from the East Punjab, and then they settled in these newly established agriculture mandis, and you call it markets, which and then they flourish up into cities and towns. So this is the huge area. So this whole water irrigation system is water is provided by the glacier melt and slow level rise. Glacier melt and snow, and also the monsoon through the monsoon source. Another third source is the monsoon. So another aspect which I like to mention, that only the surface irrigation is not important. The groundwater is also important for the irrigations. Almost it provides half of the percentage of the irrigation. If you can see from the left side, the graph, it provides the half of the irrigation of the total surface and groundwater irrigations. So there's a huge water economy that's helped. But this most particularly, that this water is mostly available at the northern side of the Pakistan, and if you travel to the south, for this groundwater becomes saline, and then it is not able to, you can't able to use it. So I will explain it later on in my presentations. This slide shows that the impact on people, the people who are living in these areas. If you see on the right hand side, you see that most of the extreme poor is also living. Of course, there is huge agriculture activities there, but this agriculture is not providing a livelihood to, and the resources for people to come up the poverty. So the reason is that most of the people are living in rural areas, and rural areas there is a single sector dependency, and only and the high rate of poverty. You can see that it's 24.4% of people are poor. But the major point is that there is also 21.7% transitory poor. So if there is any shock in the climate or in the economy, just like the COVID, so this poverty has multiplied. So agriculture, or particularly the rural areas, the poverty is right there. So it's this hallmark, is the main characteristics of the rural area. So it's very much linked to the irrigation aspects. And lastly, the thing which is very important, that the landless and small farmers community, which is living in the rural areas, and it constitutes 75% of the total population, 92 million. It's not a small number. So these are structurally poor, so they are become very vulnerable to the agricultural productivity. Either it's due to the decline in availability of irrigation water, or any heat stress. So, for example, if there is a decline in wheat production, there is a study conducted in 2014, that if there is a decline in wheat production due to heat stress, mostly in winter, so mostly out-migration is through the people out-migrated, particularly from the landless and non-farm households. So it's a climate migration is there, which is much related with the agriculture productivity and irrigations. So this is the basic statistics of the food security in Pakistan. Although Pakistan is producing enough food for, but the issues of excess utility and distribution is very much there. So a lot of people are still food secure, moderately to high food insecure populations. Huge undernourishment is there, and stunting is there. Among 40% of children who have 5 years of age, they have stunting. So in the other side, the right hand side, the agriculture production is projected to be affected by the climate change, and you can see the study by Ahmed et al. In 2015 that the gains and the losses during in the agro climatic zones in different climate scenarios, the net impact is negative. So there are also a number of other studies that shows that agriculture is going to be drastically affected by the climate change stresses, including the maximum temperature, heat stress, or extreme events. So in this scenario, in this context, agriculture is very much important, and it is important to understand that if there is climate change impact on the crop production, how irrigation can mitigate or reduce the risk for declining agriculture production. So I will discuss both the climate change impact on irrigation and irrigation impact on climate change.
You have about 5 minutes.
Sorry. Okay. So this slide actually shows that how the climate change has drastically reduces the glacier melt because because it increased early snow melt, and there is a leading to reduction in the overall water availability, and thus there is a profound impact on overall seasonality and hydrological regime of the area. So in the right hand side, if you see the maps, the green light shows the green lines and dotted line shows the baseline, and the straight line shows the model line. So you can see that the glacier melt is 1 month later, and the snow melt is 1 month earlier. So it's a huge variation in snow melt and glacier melts, and also to other parameters like rain, and there is a 1 month lag here. So that's greatly reduced the availability of irrigation water. And similar results was found by the Amar seal, and that's hugely impact the early stages of crop growth. The second impact is on the significant spatial impact on the monsoon rainfall, and the studies by Shaukat et al. And Hanif has shows that that observed trend of monsoon rainfall has changed. For example, you see the right hand side that in 2010 the rainfall, monsoon rainfall has shifted westward about 100 kilometers away, and then from the traditional monsoon zone. So that devastates the whole area, because that area is not vulnerable, not used to of these such type of floods. Second, which Wim also has very in detail has discussed the impact of irrigation on climate change, on particularly the local temperature that affects the large-scale circulations and precipitations. Of course, this flood irrigation, which is mostly prevalent in South Asia, that greatly affects the monsoon occurrence, and they also increase the intensification of extreme events. This slide shows the water scarcity in different regions, which I also mentioned earlier, that the north of Pakistan have they have sweet water, so they have less sensitivity to change in irrigations. So, but in the south, the water scarcity, the crop is producing more, is getting more water. For example, in cotton, the water used in the north is twice much more in the south. Similarly, in summer, there is more water scarcity rather than in winter crops. So water scarcity is also there, and this is also impacted the climate change and also the agricultural productivity in Pakistan. This slide actually reinforced the previous one, that these 28 canal commands of Punjab, the water budget is negative. For example, the inflow from rain, canal water, and groundwater, and the outflow, which is through actual transpiration, the water balance and budget is negative in most of the cases. So the more water is required because of the climate change to fulfill the crop water requirement. So
you have 2 minutes.
These, yes, so I'm just going to finish it. In line of these are the period discussions. We have 4 major challenges. First is to deal with the threat to water availability, climate change. The time of irrigation is very crucial because Pakistan has fixed water allocations and very strict, very rigid cropping patterns. So it's very important that we need to tackle this timely availability of water to climate change. The second is the intersectoral and inter-provisional water competition, because within sectors, just like agriculture and drinking water and in industry, water is the competition is increases. Most particularly the water competition among the provinces is very important. As I mentioned that in the south, there is a saline water, there is more poverty, and then the irrigation water is, timely irrigation water is crucial. And then the groundwater exploitation is high, because I just mentioned earlier that groundwater is actually reducing the sensitivity of availability of irrigation water. So it's very important to regulate, but it's depleting the water resources, the groundwater resources. That's regulation is important. And lastly, the water use efficiency is important, because if you see in the right side, that the gap between the water in the canal and water at the farm is going to be huge. Although there are many other factors for this, but of course the flood irrigation and the efficiency of irrigation water is very lacking in our system. So that is very crucial for when we look at irrigation for climate change relationships. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We will now move to Slido and have a look at the different questions that were posed to our speakers. 1 second. All right, so there are quite some questions already. And we will start with the one as mentioned before that has the most, received the highest interest. And that's for irrigation, there's a higher energy consumption. Wouldn't this also increase greenhouse gas emissions unless renewables are used? I think this question came up in the first presentation.
Yes, I'm happy to give an answer to this question. Thanks, Inga, and thanks to the person asking this question. I think it's a very good question, very interesting question. My answer would be that this effect is likely, or it is already included in our climate simulations, because we use prescribed greenhouse gas concentrations for our historical simulations, which means that, well, the CO2 concentrations that are measured in the atmosphere are included in our simulations. So if irrigation expansion leads to higher emissions of greenhouse gases,
I have the feeling we lost Wim.
Yes, I think his connection is frozen.
Yep. Okay. Then I think we will first move on. We have some questions which are directed to Wim, so we are just going to skip those. We have this one, maybe I can bring it up. Is irrigation expansion due more to commercial farming practices or population increase? I think this, maybe Kashif, you could respond to.
So the question is about for irrigation, there is higher energy consumptions. Would this result increase greenhouse gas emissions unless renewables are used? Of course, if you use the energy, the greenhouse gas emissions are there. But for the South Asia, for particularly for Pakistan, irrigations, energy is for the surface irrigation. Energy is not much required, but for the groundwater extractions, yes, of course, two wells are used, and mostly the two wells are based on the based on electricity. The water electricity is used, and also fuel, other carbon fuels are also used. So I think greenhouse gases, if we use the energy, then of course the greenhouse gas emissions are going to be increased. But of course, there is not much increase in the emissions due to the irrigation, I think so. But this is not my area of expertise, so I can't give it much more detail on that. Thank you.
Thanks. There's one more question directed at you. Has Pakistan considered policies on which crops are grown and where within the country, considering climate resilience of crops and water needs?
Yes, we have actually Pakistan has a lot of policies, particularly to the agriculture. We have the plans and we have the policies, and but of course the cropping patterns, which is very much rigid in a sense. If you say that we have three to four major cropping patterns: rice, wheat, cotton wheat, and maize wheat, and sugarcane wheat. So it's very much there. The government has planned and sometimes think about that. The cotton and the sugarcane has taken much of the water, so they have planned to replace it. But of course, it is very much related to the social and economic activities of the country. So still, there is no such mass level. There is no such type of activities in Pakistan going out to change the cropping patterns, which is actually need of the time. We have lots of virtual water trade in terms of growing basmati rice in Pakistan, and the cotton, and also the sugarcane, which we can replace with more less loving, water loving crops, and we can even import the sugar if we can reduce the sugarcane. But it depends upon the policies, economic and social policies, and how the people can react with these, because traditionally the agriculture, the people have used to grow the types of crops which are actually from the generations they are growing. So climate change, of course, make them realize that they need to change it, and also at some level, at the small scale, the things are changing and the people are using, rather than changing the crop, they are using the techniques which are more irrigation efficient, which are they efficiently use the water. So that's the answer to this question.
So we now take some time with Wim and Kashif to actually answer remaining questions. Because we had some technical difficulties and lack of time, we want to now come back to some of the comments and some of the questions addressed by participants of the webinar. And we will start with a comment to Wim. And the comment is, your presentation may lead to the interpretation from public policy that we need to expand irrigation to lower temperature in our areas, which can lead to a problem. Wim, what is your point on this?
Yes. I would like to start by saying that this is indeed a very good remark, and that I also agree with this point. So, because there was limited time, I did not have the time maybe to go in very much detail here. But what the goal of the studies which I've presented here is to try to explain the absence of warming in some of the historical temperature records that we have over the 20th century. So this is a possible way of explaining what has happened to explain this absence of warming. And we find in this study that we can explain absence or lower than expected warming during hot days, for instance, in India, but also in other irrigated regions, that we can explain this through irrigation expansion. Now, why does this, from this conclusion, does not automatically follow that we should go towards an expansion of irrigation in the future as a local adaptation strategy? Why is this not the case? I think, well, two main points. First of all, we are talking here only about temperature, but what humans feel is a combination of temperature and humidity, and this combines into heat stress. Now, irrigation may lower temperature, but it also increases the amounts of moisture in the surface layer, which may cancel out the benefit of lower temperatures. And we have analyzed this actually in our climate simulations, and other teams are also working on this similar analysis, showing that the added moisture in the surface layer really removes the benefit of the temperature, of the reduced temperature completely. So you have no change in heat stress, which is what people feel. So expanding irrigation may not be a solution into the future already from that perspective alone. Now, in addition, I would also very clearly like to, and would like to highlight here that if you want to, that irrigation expansion is not only depending on climate targets, of course, but it's very much depending on a whole range of criteria. One important one related to food security, but also water availability. So a whole range of sustainability criteria need to be taken into account when thinking about future changes in irrigated area. And if you look at the future scenarios that are available, for instance, from the integrated assessment models, you see that there is a strong uncertainty, a large uncertainty, but that there are not scenarios with massive expansion in irrigation extent. Rather, I would say there is, in many scenarios, a plateau, or in some cases even a decrease in irrigation extent in the coming decades. So all in all, I very much agree that this is not a message to policymakers, please expand your irrigation, but that's certainly not the message we want to send. And also in the LAMACLIMA project, the new European project, we are investigating how irrigation may be useful in terms of agricultural management in the coming decades. But we are not starting from the premise that expansion is a good thing, for sure.
Thank you, Wim. Kashif, would you like to add?
Yeah, I think Wim has very well explained the relationship that how the irrigation affects the climate, not only the temperature, but also the climate. So I think there is quite enough scientific evidences are required to at least think about this thing. But for me, for a person who is who's practitioner, more practitioner, and deals with the policy making and looking for the water in when it is competitive among different sectors. So I think in a country like Pakistan, where water is very scarce, and there's a number of other sectors that they demand for water. So expanding simply for the irrigation, I think irrigation for lowering temperature or playing with the climate, I think it's not the message which we are discussing here. So I think this is not viable. Thank you.
Thank you, Kashif. The next question is also directed to Wim. Why did irrigation have almost no impact on probability of heat extremes over the North China plains, despite similar irrigation areas as over the Indo-Gangetic plains?
Yes, again, this is a very good question. I'm really happy to see people posing such good questions on the occasion of this presentation. So we have also discovered this, and that indeed in China, the irrigation influence in our simulations is much smaller than in South Asia. And we do not have a final conclusion for this, but we have a hypothesis. And the hypothesis is that the two regions have a difference in background climate. And this notably relates to what is known as different soil moisture regimes. You have dry soil moisture regime, transitional soil moisture regime, and wet soil moisture regime. And our hypothesis is that irrigated regions in China are located in the wet soil moisture regime, whereas the South Asian irrigated areas are rather located in the transitional regimes. What does that mean? It means that in the wet regime, evaporation is energy limited, so limited by the amount of energy available. So if you add more moisture to the soil, it may not necessarily lead to more evaporation, evapotranspiration. Whereas if you're in a transitional soil moisture regime, if you're going to increase your soil moisture in such regime through irrigation, you're going to increase evapotranspiration, because in those climates, evapotranspiration is soil moisture limited. So this is our hypothesis, but again, we do not have a final conclusion about this. So, but different in background climate, whereby adding moisture to the soil in one climate leads to a stronger response in evapotranspiration than in the other climate. That's the hypothesis.
Thank you. The next question is whether you could explain why you have irrigation influence away from irrigated areas. So for example, in the Sahara.
Yes. So indeed, our climate simulations quantifying the effects of irrigation on temperature extremes, but also on climate in general, are showing the strongest effect in irrigated regions, but are next to those strong effects in irrigated regions, also showing effects in remote regions. We call this non-local effects or remote effects of irrigation and of land management in general. I would like to add the caveat that we have to be, in my personal opinion, be very careful in trying to explain such features that we find in a single Earth system model. I think we can be fairly confident, and this is also what scientific literature is showing, that the local effects are robust across the models. But then if you start comparing the non-local effects and the remote effects, you can see that there is a very strong model dependence. So in our simulations, we get a cooling effect over the Sahara, a non-local effect there, suggesting that irrigation, perhaps in the Nile Valley or in the Middle East, is changing atmospheric circulation, leading to a cooling, or maybe also changing cloud cover, leading to a cooling in the Sahara. But you do not necessarily find the same response in other climate models. Similarly, the German climate model, for instance, MPI ESM, is showing a strong precipitation response in East Africa, in response to irrigation in India. There is a study by Philippe de Vreese in Geophysical Research Letters in 2016 advocating this. In general, I think it's important to try to quantify the non-local effects through a multi-model approach. And it's only if we can show that these non-local effects are robust across a range of Earth system models that we can start to build confidence in these non-local effects of irrigation and other land management techniques. And this is exactly what we are trying to achieve within the new European project LAMACLIMA.
Thank you, Wim. And then we have another comment which you might want to react to. In support to your assumption that in future climate-induced water scarcity may trigger accelerated temperature increase in irrigated regions, the CRU observations suggest the temperature in the region of former Aralsee had been increasing at comparatively high rates.
I'm not sure that I fully understand the comment here, but what I take from it is that the person asking this question has been analyzing the crew observations over the Aralsee and finding high rates of warming after irrigation has been shut down. This is a correct interpretation indeed. Then this would be a sign that indeed when irrigation stops after, for instance, like the desiccation of a lake or the fallback of irrigation, which is quite widespread in this region, that there is accelerated warming in this region happening. This could indeed be some kind of an example of things that could happen in other regions in the coming decades if water scarcity would start to limit irrigation. Yes. I can say that we have a new PhD researcher in my team at VUB working exactly on this question. Okay, how can we, what will be the implications of projected changes in water availability for irrigation effects on climate?
Thank you. I would now like to pass to Kashif. We have a question which is climate change is becoming one of the key drivers for rural-urban migration. How do you think that investigating in irrigation could be a solution for national food security?
I think this question has two parts actually. First one is related to the rural to urban migration, and it's this asking about its key drivers. Of course, if we consider the subject area of the subject of this seminar is about irrigation. So the society, which is the rural society, which is essentially developed or constructed around the irrigation infrastructure, and then different irrigation companies were developed, and then huge migration was occurred in early 90s due to this irrigation development. Of course, irrigation is very important with respect to their decisions to migrate. But recent evidences which tells us that it's not the direct relationship of changes in or availability of irrigation water to the migration decision, but its relationship is more indirect. That there is, for example, there is heat stress during the winter season crops, and that winter season crops, which is for in Pakistan, is wheat. It's very important for livelihood for most of the population, and also the food security. So if that crop is affected, then it's ultimately affect the crop yields, and then farm incomes, and ultimately the farm labor actually get affected from the decline in yields of these crops. So indirectly, this irrigation during the winter season has an impact on people to discuss or decide about migration. So, but that right now there is no direct evidence is still available that the people are moving from the rural areas because of the lack of irrigation or some other climate changes, just like heat stress or extreme events, just like floods and droughts. So its indirect relationship is there. Regarding the second question, that how do you think that investing in irrigation could the solution of national food security? I think it's very important. The water which flows from the barrages, for example, from Mangla Dam or Trebela Dam, and then it's diverted to different canals. So the water that started from the glaciers and then reaches to the farm, the allocated water, about 30 to 40%, and even sometimes it's more than that percent, that is wasted because of conveyance losses, because of seepage, because of evapotranspirations, and many other reasons. Theft is another reason for water non-irrigation. Water is not available to the farmers, and then its effect on the crop productivity. So if we invest on irrigation, particularly the irrigation infrastructure, if we can reduce the water losses, which is about 30 to 40 million acre feet. So it's a huge water. So if we can able to reduce that water, save that water, then of course there is your crop productivity will enhance, your more area goes under agriculture, and then this gives us the answer for your national food security. Yes, if we invest in irrigation, then we can have a good food security for the nation, I think so. Thank you.
Thank you. Then we move on to the next question. What are the opportunities and challenges in adopting the water, food, energy, climate nexus approach in addressing water and food security?
Yes, I think, of course, there are many opportunities. This nexus, water, food, energy nexus, and climate, it's four-pronged nexus. Actually, it's very complex, and if we try to understand this phenomena, it's very complex, and it's difficult to conceptualize it in an integrated way. First challenge is this, that how we can integrate this thing and we can understand, particularly at the research level, about the data, is how much data is available to understand their linkages and their relationships, and then how we can able to understand their pros and cons, and their relationship, how much is related to in four categories. Conceptualization is important at the research level or academic level, and second, then when we have to make the policies, then it's policies is making a policies. It's a complex with complex relationship. It's again a challenge because policy makers sometimes have less time, or they less eager to understand the complex relationship. So its first challenge is to make it more simplistic way, present this in a more simplistic way. So issues are important, of course, and the relationships are important, and its relationship with the water. So that how different water availabilities due to climate change will affect this whole nexus. So that's the type of challenges are there. Opportunities, of course, is here. If you can understand this whole nexus between the different stakeholders, I think this provides you the more possible solutions for your food security issues, for your nutrition, or for your poverty, rural poverty. So that's if it is understandable well, and if it is implemented well, so that they have the opportunities to tackle many social or economic challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Kashif. I would actually, the next question goes to both of you. So I would first ask Kashif to answer. The question is water pollution a problem for crop irrigation, and can this be included in the models?
Yeah, I think water pollution is important, not only for environment purpose, but also climate purpose, and also for the purpose of people health and ecosystem health. You know that lots of fertilizer is applied, pesticide is applied while during the irrigation, and that pesticide, which if I understand well, and that pesticide and that fertilizer that runoff from the through the irrigation water and then the drainage or canals, and then it's affect the ecosystem and also the ecosystem of our rivers and habitat of different species. So eutrophication actually that's affect that's the chemical supplied in the 22 million hectares of land in Pakistan. That all pollution that in terms of fertilizers or pesticide that goes into or rivers and then to the or sea, and then they affect the ecosystem, and there are many evidences that affect the large part of or natural habitat. For example, in Indus river, we have the blind dolphins, and which is actually very unique. They have so that is affected by this water pollution. So of course, this is one of the side effects of the irrigation, that the pollution in different ecological zones or habitats are increasing. So that need to be taking care in the models and also in our policy discussions and research agendas. I think it's important. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Wim, could you talk a little bit about whether this can be included in models?
Yeah, so water pollution is at the moment not considered in our system models. Within the intersectoral impact model intercomparison project, ISIMIP, there is now an effort ongoing to start better representing water quality in impact simulations. And if this gets implemented in land surface models, potentially this could also be included in earth system models. But to be honest, I think we are still far away from having water pollution effects on crops through irrigation being accounted for in our models.
Thank you. The upcoming questions, I think, are rather technical, so I think they are mostly related to modeling. How does CESM source irrigation water, in brackets groundwater or rivers? And did you look at how sustainable irrigation in those CESM simulations is?
So in the simulations, which at the time when we performed our simulations, there was no limitation on irrigation water availability, which means you take you draw your irrigation water from runoff, but if you run out of runoff, you just draw it from the ocean essentially. So there is no availability limitation on irrigation in our study. Now, in the most recent version of CESM, this has been included. So this, the effect of water scarcity on irrigation can now be accounted for as an option in the model. We did investigate how sustainable irrigation is by comparing irrigation quantities in particular locations against the annual runoff of that location. We found that from that perspective, irrigation could be potentially sustainable in South Asia. Now, if you think about the reality where there's a lot of groundwater pumping happening in that region, you know that the reality is very different from the model. I think this mostly stems from the fact that there is a mismatch in time between the runoff available and the need for irrigation. So I think this is why in practice, if you check, there's a lot of groundwater pumping and unsustainable irrigation. Another region which we, for instance, investigated was the Mediterranean, and there we found that already today irrigation quantities are exceeding renewable freshwater resources available through runoff. So already there in that case, it's unsustainable in the Mediterranean.
Thank you. Next question is, when isolating the effects due to irrigation, the negative relationship of warming versus irrigation fraction is overestimated in NCAR. Any guess why?
Yes, so indeed our climate model overestimates the irrigation-induced cooling compared to the observations in this particular comparison that the question is referring to. Well, from first sight, you would think, okay, this is a problem with the model, but we made two versions of that figure. One with the latest release of COO, which is TS 4.02. Then we also made the same figure with a previous version of COO, of the observational reference database COO, finding that in that case there was actually a very nice agreement between the model and the observations. So I should and I should stress here that the only difference between these two models of these two versions of the COO data set is a different interpolation technique to account for missing data. So it's not like that there was more data added in the newer version. No, just a different post-processing of those temperature records. So my take on this is that there is, next to the uncertainty in the model, which is obviously present, there is also uncertainty in the observational reference. And we should also be, in this context, be careful with taking this as a truth. Why? Because there's very few observations available. There are very few long-term records in those irrigated hotspots. And if you have a long-term record, well, this will typically be also located in a particular location, which may then also not match with the irrigated field and non-irrigated fields, for instance. So in general, we have to be aware of the uncertainties both in the model and the observations in this particular comparison.
Thank you, Wim. Have you studied the effects of the different types of irrigation on this temperature change?
So in the simulations which we presented here, we do not explicitly consider irrigation techniques or irrigation methods. The amount of irrigated water is quantified and then applied to the surface as kind of as a somehow increasing precipitation amount reaching the soil surface. This is how the irrigation is implemented. So at the moment, there is no global climate model, no Earth system model that represents different irrigation techniques, but you do feel in the community that this is starting to become, that more and more people are getting interested in this. And as far as TSM is concerned, in my team, there is a new PhD researcher which started last fall. And the goal of his PhD research is to implement these irrigation techniques into the climate model. So we are actively working on improving the model to account for irrigation techniques.
I think the next question has partly been answered, but I'm still going to pose it. Are we talking about irrigation by both groundwater and surface water?
Indeed, this relates to one of the earlier questions. Our model does not differentiate between groundwater and surface water for irrigation. The irrigated water is taken from surface water, either runoff or the ocean if the surface runoff runs out. And is not explicitly considering groundwater pumping. So yeah, global groundwater modeling is notoriously difficult and is one of the frontiers in land surface model developments as part of our existing models. So we do not consider these differences in this study.
All right, thank you. And then we have a last question. Is there a possibility to model projections including more efficient irrigation due to scarcity and drought? And how would the cooling effect change in this case? I think also partly already answered.
Yes, indeed. So I can be short, but indeed you can use this model to perform future projections. There is now a recent paper by Ben Cook, which just came out a few weeks ago, looking at basically considering the idea of water scarcity for irrigation. So in principle, if you this can now start to be analyzed. But first, we plan to analyze this as well. But first, the model needs to be improved to account for irrigation techniques. And indeed, if irrigation would become more efficient in the future, there is the possibility that the cooling effect may reduce and that the greenhouse gas signal would emerge from the noise in those regions at a faster rate. So we may possibly, hypothetically, we may see accelerated warming in the coming decades as irrigation gets more efficient in specific regions.
Thank you. I think that was the last question. I want to thank everyone for listening, and of course thank Kashif and Wim for answering these questions. If you want to read more about LAMACLIMA, you can go to the project page or follow us on Twitter. And we still have a third webinar coming up on the 23rd of June. If you want to sign up, you can find the link here. Thank you, everyone.